And next up we have Aurora's Rift, Celestial Arcanist, book number 1, written by Emmy Mears. It is 269 pages. It is $4.99. It is available on Kindle Unlimited. Here's the author's description. Evie Winterbourne has had it. After 5 exhausting years of video game marketing for a struggling MMORPG and one too many instances of her ideas getting ignored by her boss, Evie's fortune seems to have a change when a chance encounter introduces her to her company's rival just as she quits her nightmare job. Evie's dreamed to work on games themselves until her ex cheated her and her team out of their beloved project success. And it seems that the rival CEO knows her story and her potential. As a gift, he gives her the chance to play his blockbuster single-player fantasy game, Aurora's Rift. And the world within just might change Evie's life forever, inside the game and out. So there we go. There's a little bit more, but it doesn't matter. This is the author of this particular novel has a dozen fantasy and urban fantasies to her name, but this is her first LitRPG story, and you can kind of tell. The beginning of the story, I think, is probably my favorite section of this novel. Actually does a really good job of setting up the main character, making you care about her very quickly. And it definitely explains why the main character is going to spend an extended amount of time in the single player game. And again, this is probably that's first like 15%. 10 is 10% is my favorite part of the story because you can tell the author has a load of experience, just kind of doing character development stuff, and it plays it really well. Like the novel description does a good job of like kind of summarizing it, but nice stuff. After that, though, when it gets into the actual game world, things get mixed. The game story portion of the novel really just, for me at least, felt like a fantasy story with dedicated sections that dealt with RPG mechanics. And again, this might be just a consequence of this being the author's first RPG story. She may really be a gamer, but she writes fantasy and urban fantasy novels, and those sections are not poorly written, but they feel like they conflict with the game stuff sometimes. Like she's definitely leaning more towards the fantasy section, which is more of what she's written previously, and that's perfectly fine. But I can tell, and it kind of bothered me. Like there were just dedicated sections to character creation or sections for assigning stat points and picking spells. But the majority of the rest of the novel feels more like a fantasy story, and part of that is the setup of the story and kind of the premise and the way that the game world is set up. It feels like the main character is supposed to be in this virtual reality first-person single-player game, rather, right? So I go into this with an expectation of that kind of setup where the main character's in a game. It's very gamey. The main character's aware she's a gamer. She's doing gamer stuff, and that's not what this is. Instead, when the main character logs into the story, and then this is a minor spoiler, instead she lives. There's this system in place where she lives as one of the natives of this world, and she has memories of this, and whether they're implanted or they're actually she's living through the situation doesn't matter. What it comes off as essentially is that instead of the main character being the main character from outside the game, she feels like a fantasy character who grew up in this world as an elf, and her thoughts process in the story is like, oh, my uncle so and so is going to be okay with this because we've had this whole history of like enjoying comforting strangers or whatever, or she name drops and there's a bunch of world history and lore that the main character just kind of spouts on, and I feels like, oh, she hasn't earned it because that's not what was presented to me as the reader. She didn't actually learn to not earn it. It's just like, it feels like it's a download and she just magically knows a bunch of lore and stuff and she's conveying it to us. And I'm like, it just felt like there was this weird disconnect from what my expectations were as a reader with the premise of this being set up in a single player virtual reality game as LitRPG instead of a fantasy story set on a RPG planet, which is a very different setting. And had that been that setting, this would have made a lot more sense, and it would have, I think, done better with me personally. But because I had these other expectations, and there was just this word mix, it just ended up not working for me, and that's kind of what it comes down to. The story itself, again, not poorly written. The author has a plethora of titles. She has fans that really enjoyed the way that the story is written. But again, it's also because it leans more towards, I think, that other works that she has. The magic system in the story is, again, more of a fantasy terms. There are this is LitRPG. I don't want to make sure that's pretty clear. There are stats, there are character sheets, there are spell descriptions, there are quest descriptions. All that stuff exists in the story, but they feel mostly again like separated, and it's kind of hit or miss whether or not they were even acknowledged in the story. And again, this just feels kind of like I'm going to say rookie mistake of like somebody who's coming from a different genre and jumping into this, but that's what it feels like. For example, the fantasy terms, again, fantasy magic system, isn't it really in game terms? It's described this way. I'll read you a couple lines from it. It says, I laid the lines of the trying threads across each other over and under around to form a lattice, threading heat into the spell. And again, that's because the magic system feels very fantasy, even though like those particular spells have spell descriptions. They're doing things that are outside of those spell descriptions because it's more of a magical fantasy, kind of system, which is very flexible. It does whatever the author needs it to do, right? But in a virtual reality game world system, that's not the case. Like you can't. I mean, that doesn't make sense to my gamer brain. In a game, the rules are the rules, and you can't just magically bend them or do something different just because you want to. You can in a fantasy story, but in the LitRPG story, the expectation is it's different. So there it is. I talked about the RPG stuff already, that they exist. There are stats in the story, character sheets, all the good stuff. The main character does improve her stats when she levels, but again, the stats don't really have an impact on the story. Having low strength doesn't really impede the main character. Having high magic doesn't really help her out very much. And again, the spells have inserted descriptions, they don't really actually have any limits. The main character kind of does what she wants with them, whether it's making new things or whatever the case is, and there's no real, limit to them. It's just, they are the way they are, even though they have, some, like I said, the author went out of her way to make sure that the descriptions are there, but they don't really seem to matter to the story as far as like I could tell. Again, I called it fantasy flexible. Overall, not a terrible story, not poorly written in any way, shape, or form, but it didn't work for me because, again, I always felt like the game mechanics really didn't matter to the story. It is, again, technical LitRPG. There are levels, there's all those descriptions I talked about. But again, if I took all those things out, I think it would actually work better as a fantasy story. And because that's what a lot of the story felt like to me. It's an opinion. And again, if it was set up as either a portal fantasy or just like a story that started in a fantasy RPG world, I think it would have felt better because the way the story unfolds to the main character knowing how this will work would have just made more sense to me. But it didn't. The premise is this is a virtual reality game with a lady from our world who's just jumping in for the first time as a single player campaign. And so there was just the schism for me. There you go. Fans of the author's other fantasy series may like this more than I would. For me, give the score 6 out of 10. That's Aurora's Rift, Celestial Arcanist, book number 1 with the score of 6 out of 10.